Many times, after a hearing, or particularly after a jury trial, a lawyer will say to me, "Judge, what could I do better? What did I do wrong? Or what did I do right? I would like to get better. What can I do?" And usually what I tell them is, well, usually if you have better facts, or if you have a better client, you'll have a better outcome. If you've got 3 credible eyewitnesses saying, your man did it, it really doesn't matter how good your arguments are. You just don't have the facts. I remember back when we were in private practice, Kay and I, we did some criminal defense work, and Kay did some appeals. And I got to tell you, Kay was a good appellate attorney. But again, you had to have the law and you had to have the facts on your side. And there was this one case that she was doing the appeal. She hadn't done the trial. I didn't do the trial. But there was a man that was charged with escape out of Collinsworth County. And the allegation is that after he escaped from the jail, that on his way out of town, he robbed the Alsops in Wellington. And so the man, he had no problem with the escape charge. That's kind of hard to fight. There's a document here that says this man is supposed to be in jail. And then there's a witness that says he's not in jail. That's the whole case right there. And he didn't fight that much. He didn't. But the idea that he had robbed the convenience store in Wellington, he fought that hard. He said, I didn't do that. They've got the wrong man. And the defense attorney at trial did a good job. He had the cashier there from Alsops. It was in the middle of the night. And he has him on the stand and he says, well, how long was he in the store? How long was the robber there? So it wasn't very long. It was like a minute, maybe 2. He just walked in, stuck a gun in my face and said, give me the money. And then he left. And then the defense attorney asked him, well, did you know my client before this happened? He said, no, never saw him before then. I didn't know him. He said, so you didn't see him for very long, and you had never seen him before, and he had a gun in your face. Is that right? That's right. Well, was it a big gun? Biggest gun I've ever seen. Sticking right in your face. That's all you see is that hole. And so he wasn't in there very long. You had never seen him before, and you had a gun in your face. Are you sure it was my client? He says, yes, sir, I am. How can you be so sure? And he says, well, one thing is, he wasn't wearing a shirt. And when he turned to leave, I could see that he had his name tattooed across his back. And if you'll have your client take his shirt off, you'll see his name tattooed across his back. And so, of course, the prosecutor, when it was his turn, says, Judge, I want the defendant to stand up and take off his shirt and show the jury his back. And the judge orders it. And the man does. And, of course, there in 3-inch letters is his name, Salinas, across his back. And when you have facts like that, your arguments really don't make much of a difference. You need better facts. But when attorneys ask me that, I actually do take it seriously. I do. And usually what I tell them is you need to consider that it's not so much what you say, it's what the jury actually hears that's important. You can have the most brilliant argument ever, and you can have the best facts ever, but if you don't communicate those arguments and facts to the jury, it doesn't make any difference. It's not about what you say. It's about what you communicate to the jury. Y'all remember that old movie back in the 60s? A Paul Newman movie, Cool Hand Luke. I really like that movie. It's one of my favorites. There's lots of good lines in there, and there's good scenes, and a lot of funny scenes, and it's got a little bit of everything. It's got humor. It's got tear-jerker moments, very dramatic moments. Got just a little bit of romance, but not much. There's some good lines in there. And Paul Newman, he is a prisoner in the South in a prison, and he is on a work gang. And he doesn't like it, and he escapes one time. But he gets recaptured, and he gets brought back to the prison camp. And the warden is played by an actor named Strother Martin. And after Paul Newman's been brought back to the camp, the warden, he's addressing the whole prisoners. And one of his lines there is, what we have here is a failure to communicate. And that's one of the famous lines out of that movie. It's in there several times. Failure to communicate. And I like that line. because I think it applies in a lot of situations, not just in the movies. I think it applies sometimes to lawyers. It may apply to judges sometimes. And sometimes it may apply to preachers. And sometimes when we have this very common situation of failure to communicate, it's the speaker's problem. Sometimes it is. But sometimes it's not the speaker, it may be the listener. That the listener doesn't do his job. And we're going to look at a passage today where there is a failure to communicate. And we're going to look at Mark chapter 10, starting in verse 35 through 45. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" And they said to him, "We are able." And Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." And when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. And Jesus called them to him and said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." You know, when we look at this passage, I think many times our first reaction is, those stupid apostles. How could they have such an attitude? They've been with Jesus for 3 years, and he's been teaching them, and he's been showing them, and all this time they've been following Jesus, and they don't understand. And maybe there's something to that approach. Maybe there is. But I think that that's looking at this passage a little shallowly. I think if we look at it a little deeper, I think if we look at it together, that maybe together we can find a message in there that applies to us. And one of the verses that I think from that passage that I've overlooked many times is verse 41, where it says that the disciples heard it. The 10 heard it. Obviously, James and John are having a conversation with Jesus, and they're over here. And the other 10 are over here listening. And they're overhearing that conversation between James and John and Jesus. And I think that's a good way for us to look at it. That if we use our imaginations and we think we're overhearing that conversation just as the 10 did, that we're listening in and overhearing it, that we can have an opportunity to listen to what Jesus has to say with fresh eyes. That we listen to it with an open heart and an open mind, and that we can hear. If we imagine that we are there. Now, if we're going to put ourselves in the position of the other 10 listening in on the conversation with Jesus, with James and John, we have to have a little context in order to be able to understand. And in the verses right before this passage, Jesus tells the disciples that he's going to Jerusalem. And when he goes there, the authorities are going to take him and they're going to arrest him. They're going to spit on him. They're going to mock him. They're going to beat him. And they're going to kill him. And then on the third day, he's going to arise. Obviously, when we hear James and John's question to Jesus, they don't understand fully what he was talking about. They don't quite understand. And one of the things when we're thinking about James and John's failure to understand what Jesus is saying is we need to consider that this is not the first time that Jesus has foretold his death. It's not. In chapter 8, verse 31 in Mark, Jesus foretells his death. And then in chapter 9, verse 31, Jesus again foretells his death. And then here in chapter 10. And each time that Jesus foretells his death, right after that, the very next passage, it shows that the disciples did not fully understand what he was talking about. In chapter 10, after Jesus foretells his death, the disciples show their lack of understanding by the questions that they ask Jesus. They ask, we want to sit on your left and your right hand. They were concerned with who is going to be the leader in Jesus' kingdom, as if the kingdom is going to be an earthly kingdom. They are looking at the kingdom of Jesus as if it is a kingdom of violence and power, as opposed to a kingdom that is based upon Jesus himself. They are looking at this as a kingdom based on the politics of power, as opposed to a kingdom that is based upon the politics of Jesus. They just don't understand the difference. They cannot imagine a kingdom that is based upon love and upon Jesus. They did not understand. It was a failure to communicate. When Jesus discusses his death in chapter 9 of Mark, the Bible tells us plain out, the disciples did not understand. But in the passage immediately following Jesus foretelling his death, the disciples are together, and what are they discussing? What they discuss is who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. That's what they want to know. And Jesus corrects them and tells them it's not based upon power, but it's based upon service. That if you want to be great in the kingdom of heaven, you must be willing to serve. The question we have to ask ourselves is, how do they fail to understand what Jesus is teaching? Jesus teaches them over and over that if you want to be great in the kingdom of heaven, then you must be servant to all. Jesus not only teaches them with words, but he shows them with the way he walks and the way he lives his life. His teaching is not one of do as I say, not as I do. Jesus walks the walk and he talks the talk. As we overhear Jesus' conversation with the apostles, we wonder about their lack of comprehension. But when we wonder about this, we must remember that in Luke chapter 18, in Luke's version of the gospel, Jesus also foretells his death. And in Luke, right after he foretells his death, the Bible tells us that the disciples tell us that the meaning of what Jesus was saying was hidden from them. Now, I'm not exactly sure what that means. It might mean that for some reason, supernaturally, they were prevented from understanding. I'm not saying that's what it means, but it could. Or it could just mean that because of their situation and their own personal understanding, that they couldn't understand. But for whatever reason, whether it's that they were prevented from understanding, or whether they just by their own limitations they didn't understand, whatever, they did not understand what Jesus meant. When Jesus foretells his death in chapter 8 of Mark, it's in 8:31 through 33, and we're going to read that. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." When we read that passage, what hits us every time is that statement by Jesus of "Get behind me, Satan." It's a very dramatic statement. It's almost a scary statement. And I understand why that's the part that we remember. But if we're going to understand why the apostles failed to understand what Jesus was trying to teach, I think the rest of that verse is very important. Where it says that when Jesus says to Peter, "You have your mind on the things of man, not on the things of God." And when we see that, I think we understand that Peter is being influenced by his culture and the world around him. If you look at this idea of crucifixion from a Roman point of view, from the Roman culture, it's completely foreign that a king could end up on a cross. That couldn't happen. That a king in Roman, he's the one leading an army. He's the one conquering, commanding people. He may command someone to end up on a cross, someone else, but he doesn't end up on a cross. And Peter is influenced by the world around him, by his culture, and it prevents him from understanding fully what Jesus is saying. His perspective is wrong. His imagination is wrong. And when we look at ourselves, are we so different? Are we influenced by our culture, by the world around us, by what we are told all the time, what it means to be powerful? Our culture says that if you want to be influential, you must be powerful. You must be rich. You must be famous. You must be handsome, whatever it may be. But that's not what Jesus says. You know, one of Martin Luther King's last sermons was based upon this passage. And he called it the drum major effect. And his point is that in our society, we want to be out in front of the parade, leading the band. We want to be out there where everybody can see us and we can be somebody. That's what our world tells us we want to be. That our world tells us we want to have the biggest house, the nicest car, the most money, the most fame. That's what we are told. And I got to tell you, Dr. King made some good points. That when he was comparing what the world wants and what Jesus wants. And that was back in 1968. Most of us in this room can remember 1968. And when we look at it, we can see that the world hadn't changed that much. People haven't changed that much. And we have some of the same problems now as we did then. And when we look at it, that back in the first century, when Jesus is teaching, people are pretty much the same as they are now. We have those same problems, that our culture influences us. Our culture prevents us from having good understanding of what Jesus was saying. And so when we read this passage, I don't think we can just say, look at those stupid apostles. They didn't understand. I think we need to examine our own lives to see if we have any greater understanding now than they did then. Now, when we look at our attitude toward this passage, sometimes our harsh attitude towards the apostles in this passage, I think it's interesting to look at Jesus' reaction to James and John. We have talked about how we overhear this conversation, just as the other 10 disciples did. But do we really hear? No, not quite. Because we don't get Jesus' tone of voice. We don't. We don't get his inflection. And sometimes if we're going to understand what he was really meaning, we really need to have that tone of voice. We really need to have that inflection. And that tone of voice is missing when we're just reading the written word. But let me ask you, what do you think Jesus' tone was like? I got to tell you, if it was me, I can imagine what my tone would be. It would be, I have told you, and I have told you, and I have told you, I have shown you, and I have shown you, and I'm tired of you. And I might be very angry. And the reason I think that would be my tone is because I've heard myself say that. I've heard myself say that in court. I have told you what my orders are. I have told you. And I've told you what's going to happen if you don't follow my orders. And I can hear that. But that's not what Jesus does he? When Jesus talks to them, he doesn't have a diatribe, a chastisement like we might have. It's much more of a patient correction. He certainly corrects them, no doubt about that. But he doesn't treat them as he might the scribes and the Pharisees, as we've seen him do sometimes. Jesus has presented the idea that in order to be great in the kingdom of heaven, you must be willing to serve. You must be willing to give your life on the cross if necessary. That has not changed in the last 2,000 years, has it? It is still the same teaching today as it was when Jesus first said it. And we probably have it just as hard a time accepting it today, at least as hard a time as the disciples did. And aren't we glad that Jesus was patient with them and that He's patient with us? I know I am, because I rely upon Jesus' patience. I need it. But when we talk about Jesus' tone of voice, let's look and imagine what His tone was like when Jesus asked the disciples if they can drink the cup that He will drink, and if they can be baptized with the baptism with which He will be baptized. Now we know what Jesus is talking about. We know what the end of the story is. We have that advantage. We know He's talking about His crucifixion. But James and John, I'm not so sure they knew it completely. But I think they should have known that Jesus is asking them, when He asks that question, can you be baptized with the baptism which I'm going to be baptized with? He's asking them, are you willing to die? Jesus had certainly told them before that if you want to follow Him, you must be willing to take up your cross. Now, many times we look at that take up your cross as something less than death, something less than being willing to die. But I don't think it would have been hard to get that idea across in the Roman world. In the Roman world, the cross meant death, an ugly death, a painful death, a humiliating death. It was not a piece of jewelry that you wore around your neck. It was something you wanted to avoid. It was meant to die. So I think that sometimes James and John may have had a little more courage than we give them credit for sometimes. I think they may have had a better understanding of what it meant than we want them to. You know, when we look at John in chapter 11, Jesus talks to His disciples and He tells them, I'm going up to Jerusalem. And they say, don't do that, Jesus. Don't go up to Jerusalem. You know that the authorities are looking to arrest you and they're looking to kill you. Don't go. And Jesus says, no, I'm going anyway. I'm going to go. And that's one of the verses there in John 11:16. It's one of those verses that send chills up and down your spine. That Thomas, old doubting Thomas, says to the other disciples in 11:16, let us also go, that we may die with Him. And when you look at that statement, that even though they knew that they might be putting their lives at risk, they were certainly still willing to follow Him. And I think we need to appreciate that they may have had a little more courage than sometimes we think. So I'm not exactly sure what John and James understood. I do not think they fully understood what Jesus was talking about. I don't think so. I don't think they would have asked that question if they had. But I do think they had some idea of the dangers involved in following Jesus. Following Jesus in that time meant that you could put your life at risk. And if you truly follow follow Jesus today, you can be putting your life at risk. But then Jesus, He says to the brothers, yes, you will drink the cup and you will be baptized with my baptism. Now, can you imagine Jesus' tone of voice then when He tells them that? What do you think went through the brother's mind at that point? If this was a movie, it would go quiet and the tension would rise. It would be quite a dramatic moment. The irony of that statement must have struck the brothers and the other disciples who were overhearing it. The brothers tell Jesus that yes, we can. And Jesus says to them, yes, you will. Even though we have this rather dramatic moment where Jesus is putting them in their place, He's still not harshly criticizing them. Jesus is still trying to teach them and make them understand the difference between their vision of the kingdom of heaven and what the kingdom of heaven is actually like. You know, now we've seen that Jesus used irony. And I like that. I like that Jesus had an ability with words and that He would use play on words and humor sometimes and irony. And He continues to use it to teach them. The brothers and the other disciples are still looking at the kingdom through worldly eyes. But when Jesus is teaching and correcting, as He describes in verses 42 and 43, the different way The world looks at positions of leadership and how the disciples will look at these positions. Jesus presents it to them that they will understand that to be great in the kingdom of heaven, the leader must be a servant of all. It's not a position of worldly power. It's not. But rather a position of lowly service. We need to consider the attitude the apostles had in asking that question. And they present it to Jesus. I find it to be remarkable that when Jesus is talking to them and teaching them, he has faith in them. He has faith in them because he says to them, "But it shall not be so among you." He doesn't say that it shouldn't be so. He says, "It shall not be so among you." And I like that. I really do. That idea has not changed, has it? We may not fully understand everything. We may not fully understand the principle of servant leadership, just as the disciples struggle with that idea. But the principle is still the same. We must be willing to give our lives in service to one another. That's not always an easy idea to accept or to understand. When we look at these disciples, there certainly was failure to communicate. Just like there was with Paul Newman back there in Cool Hand Luke. For whatever reason, the disciples could not see and they could not understand what Jesus was teaching. They saw with eyes that were influenced by the world around them, by their culture. And I've described this as a failure to communicate. But in reality, I think it's more a failure of imagination. Jesus wanted them to be able to see the world as it was supposed to be, as it ought to be, as Jesus wanted it to be, not as it actually was. That he wanted them to have the imagination to see the way it should be, the way God wanted it to be. And then to have the courage to work for that vision of what it should be. To work with the power of the Holy Spirit to work towards that world. A world that's not based on the politics of power, but rather on the politics of Jesus. And that's what we're looking for. A world where we're willing to give our lives freely for one another. You know, it takes all we have, all our life, and everything we have to follow Jesus, including our imagination. You know, Jesus told James and John that they would drink the same cup as Jesus, and they would be baptized with the same baptism. And when we participate in baptism, or when we partake of communion, we're not just engaging in some empty ritual. By drinking the cup of communion and being baptized into the life of Jesus, we are committing to being Jesus' disciple and to living the type of life that Jesus led. That is our opportunity today, to participate in communion with one another and with Jesus, and to have the imagination to go out into the world and show the world what it means to serve the Lord, to serve one another, and to serve the world.